everybody. Today is just a great day. It's not only a great day, it's a fantastic day because I get to talk to some really, really cool today. I get to visit with Adrienne Lotto. She's the Senior Vice President of Grid Security Technical Operations Services for the let me make sure, American Public Power Association. Welcome and thank you for stopping by the podcast.
Thanks so much, Stu. I appreciate you all having me today.
I'll tell you what, when people sit back, Adrienne, and you're the security and the vice president there, we want to hear a little bit about what you do there. Because when people, you walk into your room and you expect to flip the switch, but there's a ton of stuff that goes on with the grid. So what do you do basically there at the American Power Association?
So APPA is the National Trade Association representing public power members all across the United States, not-for-profit electric utilities. And we serve about 49 million Americans, as you said, who want to walk in and hit that switch and want the power on.
Right.
APPA and our members have some of the most reliable power in the United States. So we serve a large majority, very different communities, some very large, some very small, and we're throughout all 49 states. The only one we're not in is Hawaii. So unfortunately, that remains on my bucket list of places to visit because I won't be going there for work anytime soon.
Oh, now that's funny. I mean, why don't you try to get that into your territory? Now, if you guys cover Alaska, correct?
That's correct. Yeah, Alaska is also up. Has public power as well.
Boy, I tell you, I've done a lot of time up in Alaska, and there ain't really a lot of grid around there. You got microgrids all over the place.
A lot of microgrids. That's right. I've spent some time up in the University of Fairbanks. We went and did some traveling above. But you're right, lots of microgrids up in Alaska. Down here in continental United States, though, we serve some large areas, for example, out in LAPWD, like Los Angeles Public Water is one of our members. And then we have very, very small members as well, who may only have even just a couple of employees who are helping to run the grid.
Boy, I'll tell you, that's quite a job. And when you sit back and think about, I want to give a shout out to the linemen and line women and everybody keeping the grid up. Holy smokes, they're out there in good, bad weather and everything else, and they are some unsung heroes. And I just want to give them a quick shout out as well.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the line workers, men and women who go out every time there's a storm, particularly in mutual aid. I think that's one of the things that the electric sector is well known for, including in public power, is when a storm hits or even if it's a storm up in the Northeast, a snowstorm, or down in the Southeast and Hurricane Alley when something comes through, our members really kind of step into action and help one another out. Because as you said, the name of the game is to restore power as quickly as possible to serve communities. And that's what's expected, and the line people really make that happen. So a big shout out to them.
You bet. With grid security, I mean, there is so much. You and I were chit-chatting ahead of the discussion here, and so when we sit back and think, you go in, there's a lot of physics that are involved with turning on that light switch. I was visiting with an executive from Pakistan last Thursday, and the rest of the world doesn't have the grid that we have here. They get like so many hours a day that they flat have on, and we take it for granted. What do you see as far as some of the physics that go on?
I think the changing nature of the grid is occurring as we speak. There's more and more pressure, right? Whether through clean energy policies or even state policies, to take a look at some of the different generation assets perhaps maybe taking a look at retiring coal in certain areas. And really, the industry is trying to move more into cleaner forms of energy. You'll see a lot of states and, again, utilities exploring things, as you mentioned, wind turbines or other types of DER, and trying to understand and taking a look at the physics on how to bring those types of generation assets into the fold towards more cleaner types of energy. So there's definitely a changing generation mix that's occurring, and that's being supported through some of the things that you're seeing on the federal level, as well as different states. So that's changing. We have threats of cybersecurity from nation state actors. We have physical threats. So I think there's many different aspects of the grid that are continuing to evolve.
You know, with cybersecurity, and grid security, I'm going to swear here for a second. I just want to get everybody to, this is a family show, but the chuckleheads, they were shooting the transformers. Good grief, that were going on around there. I'm going to call them chuckleheads or chatterheads. I'm not sure which, but there's a real supply problem issue. So if we get a bunch of these guys going around shooting transformers, you deal with a lot of the legislative issues going around as part of the association's normal job in trying to help that security measure. That is a national security issue if we can't get parts, correct?
Absolutely. So unfortunately, right now, supply chain is one of the top issues that's impacting the industry, particularly around distribution transformers. More and more, we are hearing from CEOs, from their procurement officers, that lag time and wait times used to be, for a distribution transformer, we could get them in a number of weeks. Now it looks like we're getting, the wait time can be upwards of a year, sometimes depending even more, or even in instances, we're also hearing anecdotally that sometimes transformer manufacturers won't even take their orders. Because they're completely at capacity and they won't be able to fulfill them. So as you said, Stu, right, when we're looking at threats from storms, as we just mentioned, or physical security, at the end of the day, the American people just want, as you said, the light switch to go on and for the lights to come on. But that takes an end-to-end process, including distribution transformers. And we've been raising the alarm that there's a shortage. And we really need the federal government to act here.
I was visiting with another grid expert, and they were saying that and this comes up to that balloon incident that just went, the Chinese balloon incident rolling by. If we ever had an EMP in a certain part of just any part of the state, it would take years in order to get the grid back on if all the transformers were cooked in that area. So we may be down for a long time. And that's a big deal. I mean, we can't. And so I guess how do you convey your message to the legislator? That's a big job.
We've been raising the alarm with the legislature for quite some time now. We've been meeting with officials at DOE on a regular basis. We've gone and had meetings at the White House as well. We've even taken to the Hill to meet with Congress people and really try to explain to them that this is an all hazards issue. As you just said, EMP is one. We've already talked a little bit about physical security threats. Cyber is another one. Storms, I mean, we're about to hit storm season is another. So although the threats and the landscape continues to change and evolve, the American people expect their way of life, as you said, right? You were talking to someone from Pakistan, it looks a little different. Here in America, continuity is exceedingly important. And so continuity of keeping those lights on require transformers. And there's other, things that we're also hearing now that there are in shortage. I'll give you for instance, bucket trucks, right? You mentioned your line people earlier today, linemen and women.
Right.
The unsung heroes of the grid. We are now hearing from some of our members that even bucket trucks are getting
Wow.
harder and harder to get in. So we want to just ensure that Congress continues to, pay attention and make
Right.
sure that they allocate funding the next go around for grid components. Not just, they've certainly funded clean energy components, which is
Right.
important, but we need to ensure reliability first.
Oh yeah, with renewables, wind and solar, if we're going to get to carbon net zero, we have to have a ton of other stuff and upgrades to the grid. And, it's kind of like air traffic controllers. You always hear how bad they are, but it's the old balancing authorities. Those guys are like need some serious help. Maybe we can put some counseling in those budgets for those guys that are doing the grid balancing authorities, because that's pretty stressful when you've got a wind farm over here and you got a coal, and then you're waiting on having them sit there. So the balancing authorities are just another group of people on the grid.
That's true. I mean, there's a ton of, as we talked about earlier, there's a lot of legislation that's advancing things like electrification, right? Electric vehicles are all the rage. A lot of, if you read
Right.
any car magazine now, there are many, many different car manufacturers are talking about just having all electric
Right.
vehicles going forward, and they've made pledges to that nature. Well, that all requires upgrade to grid infrastructure, right?
Right.
So it will take a ton of planning, and some of that planning is ongoing.
Right.
But I think ensuring that we can keep the basics on, like the lights on in people's homes, is certainly of critical importance.
Boy, you open up a can of worms here. Now I'm going to throw this squirrel at you here, and I'm going to try to see. In California, a while ago, they had where they said don't charge your cars because it was about to black out. I mean, it was in, and then they had another proposal for the legislator. I believe it was a month ago. I saw this, and they were saying that if you plug your car into the grid, they want the cars to be used as a backup for the grid. I mean, talk about a nightmare for everybody. I mean, whoa, how do we educate the legislator to be able to say, let's have a nice way forward for all of this? Because, I mean, they don't work together that way.
I think it requires conversation. I mean, similar to what we're having now, right? I think a lot of legislation gets passed by very, very well-intended people who
Right,
simply just don't understand either the physics of the grid, as you just mentioned,
right,
or the implementation of some of these policies, and
right,
what it would take to actually ensure that these things don't have cascading grid impact.
right,
So I think working within to advise of state, your state regulatory offices, your
right,
state legislatures. I mean, oftentimes we find that it's very helpful for the utility executives and their staff to go in and have open dialogue
right.
to explain some of these things, um, because I think otherwise, I think some well-intended legislation can have really deleterious effects that were not intended, right?
Oh, yeah. And so when you take a look at the infrastructure bill, in fact, in COP26, they kind of snuck in some language about natural gas and nuclear being put in as available for renewable funding. Didn't do anything until COP27, and then in COP 27 and 28, the EU and Europe said, "Oh, by the way, we're going to like allow natural gas," and then sure enough, the U.S. is now following in those same footsteps and saying natural gas is available for funding in some of these, and nuclear. So nuclear, I think you're going to see some nice stuff if they can get the regulations past some of this, because Boy, nuclear with a steady output will be nice for the grid. I mean, it plays nice on the grid, right?
Certainly. I mean, I think in all of the above, energy strategy makes sense here. I mean, we're seeing some of the DOE is continuing to work on small modular reactors. We certainly have
Right,
members that are waiting to see the outcome of those SMRs. And
right,
if positive, I know they intend likewise to kind of hop on the SMR bandwagon and see if they could bring nuclear in a smaller way back to their grids. So I think that certainly has a potential in the future,
right,
like you said. I think the generation we've seen with natural gas, that it is a just-in-time generation resource.
right.
There's, depending on where you live, even there remains some concern about whether or not that is an actual true form of clean energy. I mean,
Yep,
for example, hydropower still doesn't get, I don't think, the clean
right,
energy stamp that perhaps it should. And I
right.
think that's another form of generation that should, get those types of, that should get that recognition.
Adrienne, I agree. Geothermal also has not gotten the thing. I would rather put a lot of money into geothermal. It is good in some areas. I mean, Yellowstone, sure, but I mean, there's other technologies coming around that I think would be good investments. So,
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of money going into grid modernization, including different forms of generation, some of which we've discussed. I
right,
think it's, like you said, we're going to wait and see. I think our members are going to wait and see.
right,
But there are a lot of decarbonization goals
right,
out there from states that are being promulgated right now. There's a lot of, at least, some are even pushing,
right,
net carbon goals. So how we're going to get there, it's going to take a lot of planning and,
right.
as you said, conversation with different entities really coming together to make it happen.
Well, also one of the big things you mentioned about new homes and attaching these things with new legislation going on about reducing the home and the demand on the home would make a lot of sense. And so I'm sure you guys are working on that as well too. I mean, because there's a lot of legislation for lowering the amount of power that people use. Is that a thing that you're also looking at as well?
We generally tend to, we're working with the homeowners association at the Manufacturing Homeowners Association at the moment, actually, because what we are hearing from them is
Okay.
that a lot of cities have and states have goals of, economic development goals,
Right.
where they're trying to bring certain housing to certain communities to really rise up people out of
Right.
poverty or areas that perhaps are, maybe in lower socioeconomic areas. And
Right.
unfortunately, some of those projects are literally getting put on hold because they're unable, because of supply chain constraint, to
Oh
connect
yeah.
to grid infrastructure because of the distribution transformer shortage. So when we are talking on the
Wow.
Hill or at the White House or over in DOE, um, we are trying to articulate that the administration has these very strong electrification goals and these very strong um, goals of economic development,
Right.
all of which are certainly, I think, commendable. But
Right.
it takes, again, basic grid infrastructure like distribution transformers
Right.
to get there.
And so when you talk about the disproportionately impacted communities like we were talking about, I mean, power policy and regulations sometimes don't get down to the disproportionately impacted communities, kind of like the big push for heat pumps. And sometimes heat pumps actually pull more power and aren't as efficient. But in the Northeast, they don't like pipelines. So they don't have any natural gas, and then they have to import LNG from Russia, Trinidad, and then, other areas. And then heating oil in that area is used a lot for electrical stuff. So getting people off of coal, off of heating oil, is pretty important.
I mean, you've hit the nail on the head, right? So I'm a former New Yorker. If there is such a thing, I think once in New
Yeah,
York, born in New York, and
yeah,
raised in New York, you're always a New Yorker. But I think you've hit the nail on the head there, right? So
right,
that's an example where what you just discussed, natural gas policy, there's extreme opposition
right,
to getting natural gas through that upper
right.
corner of the state of New York. And we've seen with NERC, the Winter Reliability
Oh,
Assessment,
yes,
that there's generally concern every time the winter kind of rolls around.
right,
But you also mentioned Russia and China, right? So understanding that those two countries play a significant role in some of the threats against the grid.
hmm,
Um, so you have interesting sort of
right.
geopolitics that also are impacting the United States and our citizens in a very interesting way.
Well, Adrienne, how do we get, or how are you visiting with your membership and your crew about cyber attacks? Because I believe it was a year and a half ago or 2 years ago when the Colonial Pipeline got hit by cyber terrorists. And you always hear those rumors that are out there that cyber terrorists could take the grid down. How do you help or explain that one? Because that's frightening for me. I mean, you sit back and kind of go, them, and I'm going to use the word chowderhead again. Those chowderheads sitting there trying to get into the grid are like, scary.
I mean, I think the um, more and more about the threats to the grid,
I
including
love your heavy sigh. I'm sorry. That was absolutely hilarious. Oh, those guys breaking into the grid again.
well, I mean, so what is the silver lining, if there is any? The silver lining is that if is that more and more things that were anecdotally discussed, like the risks to the grid, including cyber, or were
Right,
classified, are now more and more becoming declassified, right? So the
right,
2018 Worldwide Threat Assessment clearly indicated that both Russia and China have the ability to have or create localized temporary disruption to the grid.
right,
So to your point, right, it's unfortunate that our certain countries want to cause harm to the American way of life.
right,
But the fact that APPA and our partners, both at the EISAC, the
right,
Information Sharing, ISAC and DOE, Department of Energy, we are
right,
able to more and more inform our members of these threats and help them.
right,
We provide tools and services to help them build their cyber resiliency, their physical resiliency
nice,
to these types of a threat. Um, you know, that I think, enabling the public and the people who are actually operating these grids to get access to that information more and
right,
more, rather than just, in the cones here in Washington, D.C.
right.
That is important that we continue to work with the federal government and make that happen. Unfortunately, as you said, there's a lot of bad guys out there that want to
Oh,
cause
yeah.
us harm.
Yeah, and I mean, even as we talked about, it's the bad weather in this place. I've been through two tornadoes here, and it even picked my pontoon boat up in the front yard and moved it 10 feet. It took out all these neighbors all up and down 2 miles down the road. And I mean, the electrical team was out here. I was out helping pull my neighbors out. And I mean, our co-op was out there and they were out in force. I mean, it was kind of like they knew it was bad weather here. They had their trucks rolling in and everything else. I mean, that's
I
some
think that's the
good.
trick, though, right? With a storm, more often than not, a hurricane at least, you get 3 to 5 days warning time. So there's pre-positioning that the utilities do up and down and position themselves to be able to roll in during the mutual aid process. A little different, obviously, when it comes to cyber attack, right? A cyber attack is often, you get very little notice. So I think the industry has become well versed in ensuring that we have emergency response plans, cyber incident response plans. We're regularly exercising those plans, sometimes alone in the utility itself, but oftentimes, as you just described, with larger emergency personnel and staff, because it is an ecosystem of people who have to come together when the bell rings to keep the lights on.
Oh, Adrienne, and so as for our listeners, and so since we have such a wide swath, everything of executives to the linemen to the oilmen and everything else, what do you recommend people do to help get? I always like also talking about solutions. What can people do to help you with your mission? Call the representatives, read up on the grid. How do we help you?
In terms of supply chain constraint, I think sounding the alarm to your energy officials, both in your state and at the federal level, discussing this podcast, discussing what we are hearing from all of our members and the shortages. And I do want to add one thing, because this has come up a few times. Sometimes people have asked me, well, is this just a public power issue? Is it only your members, Adrienne? And the answer to that is no, right? The IOUs, and you mentioned cooperatives just now, the cooperatives and the IOUs are brethren in this ecosystem, are likewise facing the same constraints. So it's across the board. So we would just ask that you talk to your local chamber of commerce, any representative, to really put pressure on that federal government to ensure that they utilize DPA funding or Defense Production Act funding to prioritize distribution transformers is really the call to action.
Boy, that's a huge one because, with the pandemic, they did use the Defense Production Act. In fact, for shipping of things around the U.S., they've used that before to get rid of the Jones Act, as a temporary thing as well, too. So the War Power Act, I believe is how it's called, I think, something like that. But anyway, they can put in those effects for wartime exemptions and get those things moving.
They've done it numerous times. I mean, again, we're talking with local, federal, here in DC, federal officials.
Nice.
The DPA has been used on things, you may recall the baby formula shortage. Right. So there's, it's been used, I think, of course, it was used during COVID, as you just mentioned, for things like getting, obviously, the vaccine out and toilet paper and things of that nature. But it even got used on things like baby formula. Believe it or not, there was a shortage in ambulances. The bed of the ambulances had a supply chain constraint and it got used. So it's been used numerous times across very different industries. And so we see no reason why it shouldn't be used here in the electric sector to keep the lights on.
Well, we've got about 5 more minutes here. But what part of New York, since you've always, you're always a New Yorker, right? What part of New York are you hailing from?
I lived mostly in Westchester County, and prior to joining APPA, I worked for one of our member companies at the New York Power Authority. So right there in, White Plains, New York, Main Street.
Nice. I went to high school and junior high in Plattsburgh, New York, and loved skiing up there, skiing in Vermont, Lake Placid. So I'm a pseudo New Yorker, but New York, upstate New York is different than the city. So, I don't know that I'm even adopted then at that point, but
I'll let the New Yorkers make the call on that one, if they're going to adopt you in or not.
Okay. Well, I can hold my own with them, if that makes sense.
You certainly did today, Stu. That's for sure.
As we take a look around the corner, and we've talked about what people can do to help you, what's coming around the corner for the association? What do you see are your next big hot buttons for Q2, Q3, and finishing out this year?
So back to the cyber front, one of the things we're tackling at the moment is cyber incident reporting. So the sector regularly has to report any cyber incidents. You mentioned, for example, a ransomware, Colonial Pipeline. We have numerous reporting if there's a cyber incident. We have to report things to NERC. We have to report things to DOE under OE 417. Most recently and soon to be implemented, we have to report to DHS under the new CERCIA cyber incident reporting law. But Congress, in its infinite wisdom, piled on yet another one. So we'd like to, we're currently in Q2, Q3, hoping to find some synergy and maybe try to find and help Congress find harmonization among the various incident reporting mechanisms. Because I think, for our members, when a cyber incident occurs, they really want to be solving the problem, having their hands on keyboards, not fundamentally worrying about having to report the incident to, 5 different federal agencies. So I think harmonization is the name of the game there. We're continuing to keep our eye on physical security. As you mentioned earlier, unfortunately, there was a number of incidents in the end of 22 into the first part of Q1 here in 23. Where knuckleheads have been trying to take the grid down for a variety of issues. So I think we need to continue to work with law enforcement and, making sure that when people are perpetrating those crimes, they don't get slaps on the wrist, but rather are really sort of prosecuted. It's a big deal, right? They should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law so we don't have copycats. So I think those are, some of the main things we're continuing to work on. And, we have some great events coming up too. So hopefully maybe squeeze in a little bit of fun in all of that as well.
Boy, that sounds fantastic. And reach out to you on either your LinkedIn or publicpower.org. Is there any other way that people should get a hold of you?
I think those are the 2 big ones, Stu. I mean, happy to get in touch with your viewers. It's been great.
Well, thank you so much and have a great rest of your day there.
Thank you. I appreciate it. This was fun.